March 6, 1945, Cologne Cathedral Square. The afternoon light fell unevenly across the ruins, casting sharp shadows against shattered stone and twisted steel. Feldwebel Karl Hoffmann pressed his eye to the cracked glass of his Panthers periscope, trying to steady his breathing. For years he had studied every American silhouette, memorizing the lines of Shermans, Stuarts, and even the cumbersome jumbo variants. But what he saw now did not belong to any recognition chart. The shape was wrong, the gun far too long. He whispered into the intercom, his voice strained with disbelief. "That's no Sherman!" The moment hung in the stillness of the square, broken only by distant artillery thuds echoing through the city. Hoffmann's crew shifted uneasily inside the cramped steel coffin, their nerves sharpened by months of retreat and rumors of new Allied machines. The tank before them carried an aura of menace, its low, sloping armor and massive barrel suggesting something entirely different from the familiar Shermans they had faced in France and Belgium. Hoffmann's heart sank as his memory of briefings and manuals failed him. 18 seconds later, history would confirm his fear. The battle had already claimed one of his comrades. Just minutes earlier, Wilhelm Bartelborth, commanding another Panther, had vanished in a storm of fire and twisted metal. The projectile that killed him was not one German crews were accustomed to facing. The 90mm round from an M26 Pershing tore through armor once thought invincible, proving in a single instant that the battlefield had changed forever. For more than 2 years, the mythology of German heavy armor had held. The Tiger and later the Panther had defined armored superiority. Their long 88s could destroy Shermans before the Americans ever reached striking distance. Their armor, thick and angled, turned aside Allied rounds with contemptuous ease. Tankers painted victory rings on their barrels, certain of their edge. Allied crews spoke in hushed tones about Tiger fever, reporting far more enemy encounters than reality justified, so deeply did fear color their perception. Yet behind the Atlantic, American engineers had been working in silence. Since 1942, the T-26 program had pressed forward, spurred by the realization that the Sherman, so effective early in the war, could not match German innovation. In Detroit and Michigan, across dozens of plants and thousands of workers, a new machine was being born. It was not merely an upgrade, but a transformation. A tank with thicker armor, a powerful 90mm gun, and mechanical systems designed to match or surpass German precision. When the first Pershings arrived in Europe in January 1945, they came under tarps and false designations, hidden even from Allied eyes. Crews trained in secrecy, their cover story rehearsed as carefully as their gunnery drills. The plan was simple: unleash them only when the Germans brought forward their heaviest weapons. Cologne would be that moment. Inside the square, Hoffmann's breath caught as sparks showered from the first Panther's demise. His instincts told him that this new tank had shifted the balance. For the first time since 1942, German tankers faced the prospect that their steel advantage no longer held. The Pershing's gun thundered across the square, a crack of authority that silenced every doubt about its purpose. Corporal Clarence Smoyer, hunched over the sight, had locked his crosshairs on the Panther's mantlet. The round struck home, slicing through thick armor that had shrugged off hundreds of Sherman shells in Normandy. Flames burst from the German vehicle, ammunition igniting in a violent chain reaction that lifted the turret in a column of smoke. Cameraman Jim Bates, crouched with his signal corps equipment nearby, caught the entire duel on film. Those frames would later become iconic, but in the square itself, it was the sudden realization that the Americans had brought something new. The Germans were not accustomed to surprises on the battlefield. Since the Tiger's arrival in 1942, their crews had lived with a confidence bordering on arrogance. They knew their guns outranged anything the Allies could field, and they positioned themselves accordingly, dominating engagements from distances where return fire was futile. A single Tiger, hidden in cover, could halt a column of Shermans, and there were stories told in every mess hall of lone German tank commanders holding back entire battalions. Michael Wittmann's rampage at Villers-Bocage became legend, reinforcing the aura that German heavy armor could not be touched. But the Pershing rewrote the equation. Its 90mm gun, adapted from anti-aircraft design, hurled shells with a velocity that left no margin for German crews to rely on range. Its sloped armor and low silhouette made it harder to spot and harder to kill. For the men inside, the changes were equally profound. Spacious interiors, padded fittings, wet stowage for ammunition, all details meant to keep them alive. The tank was not only a weapon, it was an environment designed for endurance, reflecting a different philosophy of warfare. The secrecy around its deployment amplified its impact. When the first units reached Antwerp, they were described only as maintenance equipment, wrapped and disguised as ordinary cargo. Even their operators, sworn to silence, rehearsed stories to deflect questions. By the time they rolled into forward positions, they carried with them not only steel and firepower, but also the element of mystery. German intelligence, usually sharp in detecting Allied advances, had no trace of these machines in their reports. That blindness would cost them dearly. On February 25th, Pershings were quietly integrated into the 3rd Armored Division. They were not concentrated into elite formations, but dispersed, one per task force, blending into the mass of Shermans. Their commanders carried strict orders, revealed themselves only when confronting the heaviest German armor. It was a plan that turned patience into a weapon. For weeks, German crews mistook them for Shermans, failing to grasp what waited behind that longer gun. Then came Cologne. The duel by the cathedral was not merely another skirmish in a dying war. It was a turning point in perception. German tankers had fought believing their armor rendered them masters of the battlefield. In a span of minutes, that certainty evaporated, replaced by doubt, an enemy as dangerous as any shell. The Pershing's arrival was more than the unveiling of a new tank, it was the collapse of a belief system. For years, German doctrine had depended on the assumption of technological superiority. Outnumbered and often isolated, their crews compensated with weapons they trusted to dominate any opponent. Tigers and Panthers had shaped every tactic, every ambush, every defensive stand. They were not just machines, they were symbols of invincibility. That illusion began to crumble the moment the first Pershing shell struck. Reports filtered back to German headquarters in fragments. Panthers destroyed at ranges they thought safe, Tigers hit head-on with devastating results, crews unable to explain what had killed them. At first, officers dismissed these accounts as exaggeration, the kind of battlefield rumor that often magnified Allied capabilities. But the stories grew consistent. Again and again, tankers spoke of a Sherman-like silhouette armed with a gun far larger than it should have carried. This confusion gave rise to the nickname whispered through Panzer units, the long-gun Sherman. Crews could not conceive that the Americans had designed a completely new heavy tank. They assumed the enemy had simply modified their old machine. That misunderstanding lingered, and it was deadly. German tank schools had no updated recognition charts. Manuals still advised closing with Shermans, using long-range firepower to exploit superiority. Against Pershings, these tactics became suicide. The American crews, meanwhile, were under strict instructions to conceal their advantage until absolutely necessary. Their tanks blended into columns of Shermans, their long barrels the only giveaway to trained eyes. To infantrymen and even to many fellow tankers, they appeared as ordinary vehicles. Only when German heavy armor revealed itself did the Pershing crew strike. The effect was like a magician pulling back the curtain at the exact moment of surprise. By early March 1945, only a handful of Pershings were in combat, barely 20 in total across the European theater. Numerically insignificant, yes, but their presence created waves of uncertainty far larger than their numbers. German crews, once bold in their counterattacks, now hesitated at every approach. Was that Sherman in the distance truly harmless, or was it one of the mysterious long-gunned variants capable of piercing even King Tiger armor? The question alone slowed their decisions, eroded their confidence, and dulled their edge. Psychology mattered as much as steel. A tank commander's first shot was often the decisive one. Hesitation, even for a second, could mean destruction. With Pershings in the field, hesitation became constant. Veteran German crews who had once attacked with ruthless efficiency found themselves second-guessing, and that sliver of doubt was enough to tilt engagements. On the Allied side, the Pershing was hailed as overdue redemption. Tank crews who had long endured the frustration of watching shells bounce off German armor finally possessed a weapon of parity. For them, the duel at Cologne was vindication. They had entered the square under the gaze of a cathedral that had seen centuries of struggle, and within minutes they proved to the world that the balance of power had shifted. In the weeks that followed, the Pershing's shadow spread far beyond its actual deployments. German units retreating through the Rhineland began to encounter reports of American tanks that could withstand their fire and strike back with lethal accuracy. Some accounts described being hit from over a kilometer away, the round tearing through frontal armor once believed impenetrable. Others mentioned seeing their own shells ricochet uselessly off the new tank's glacis. Even when details were exaggerated, the pattern was unmistakable. Something had changed, and it was no longer in Germany's favor. For German tank crews, the realization was devastating. They had endured years of attrition, shortages, and retreats by clinging to one constant, the belief that their machines remained superior. That belief had carried them across battlefields from Kursk to Normandy, even when outnumbered 10-1. Now, as American armor rolled across the Rhine, the very foundation of their confidence dissolved. It was not just steel that shattered in Cologne, but morale. The effect was magnified by Germany's dwindling industrial capacity. By 1945, factories bombed by Allied air campaigns struggled to turn out even 100 tanks per month. Spare parts were scarce, fuel almost non-existent. Crews often fought with half-operational vehicles, cannibalizing one machine to keep another moving. In contrast, American industry had reached a tempo Germany could scarcely imagine. Production lines in Michigan and Ohio churned out Shermans by the thousands, and when the decision was made to shift toward Pershing assembly, the transformation was swift. A single arsenal could complete more tanks in a week than German plants could in a month. Captured documents and interrogations revealed the scale of this disparity to German crews. To learn that Pershings were already entering the battlefield in dozens, with hundreds more on the way, delivered a psychological blow as severe as any bombardment. They knew that even if one Pershing fell, replacements would follow. Germany, on the other hand, could not replace a Tiger lost in combat without draining resources from every other front. It was in this imbalance that the true power of the Pershing lay. Not in numbers alone, for they were still few, but in the certainty they represented. The Americans had proven they could design a tank equal to Germany's best and mass-produce it. That combination left no room for hope. German commanders tried to reassure their men, insisting that training and tactics would still carry the day, but inside the steel hulls, the crews knew the truth. The certainty of superiority was gone, and with it went the will to fight. By late March, entire units withdrew at the mere rumor of Pershings in their sector. Tanks that should have held crossroads or bridges were abandoned after minor breakdowns. Crews who once risked everything to repair under fire now declared their machines irreparable, walking away rather than face a weapon they believed could not be beaten. The Pershing did not need to be everywhere. Its reputation traveled faster than its tracks, haunting the minds of German tankers long before they ever saw one through a gun sight. April 1945. The Reich was collapsing on every front. Bridges over the Rhine fell one after another, towns surrendered without resistance, and armored spearheads cut through what remained of German defenses. Amid the ruins, the Pershing had become a ghost story. German tank crews spoke of it in whispers, some claiming to have seen dozens when in reality there were fewer than 30 in the entire theater. Fear magnified its presence, making it seem everywhere at once. For those who did face it, the effect was paralyzing. King Tiger commanders, who once engaged Shermans with calm certainty, now hesitated at the sight of any American armor. Was it a target to be dispatched with a single shot, or a Pershing waiting to return fire with a weapon powerful enough to punch through their 115 plates? That moment of doubt, that split-second pause, cost lives. In armored warfare, hesitation was fatal. Allied intelligence reports from the period recorded a shift in German behavior. Tanks abandoned after trivial damage, crews walking away at the first sign of trouble, recovery vehicles finding machines left intact, their crews unwilling to risk combat repairs. The Pershing had done what bombing raids and attrition had failed to achieve. It broke the will of Germany's most elite soldiers, yet the irony was stark. The Pershing was not flawless. Its transmission was temperamental, its armor not as thick as the King Tiger's, its guns slower to reload than the German 88. On paper, it was closer to the Panther in balance than to a mythical super tank. But warfare is rarely about paper comparisons. What mattered was perception, and the Pershing shattered the myth of German invulnerability. The psychological collapse that followed had consequences far beyond the number of tanks destroyed. By the end of April, resistance in the West disintegrated. German armored formations that once counterattacked with fury now avoided engagements, retreating rather than risk an encounter. Entire battalions surrendered intact, their once proud vehicles lined up in fields, crews climbing down with hands raised. When interrogated, many admitted they had never actually fought a Pershing. They had only heard the stories. That was enough. The war in Europe ended within weeks. On paper, the Pershing's contribution was minor, just 20 saw combat before the surrender. But its impact was disproportionate. It represented more than a tank. It was the proof that American industry, dismissed by German propaganda as crude and incapable of refinement, could not only match German engineering but surpass it. Factories in Detroit had achieved what Berlin could not, a weapon that combined quality with quantity, power with reliability, and innovation with speed of production. In the decades that followed, German veterans remembered not just the duels but the dread. Many described the Pershing as the moment they realized the war was lost. The Tigers that had once made them hunters now felt like targets. Through the narrow vision of a periscope, they had glimpsed the end, not just of their tanks, but of the belief that technology alone could save them. The Pershing did not win the war by numbers. It won by destroying certainty. 20 tanks became symbols, their 90 guns not only piercing armor but breaking the myth of invincibility that had sustained the Panzerwaffe. In the ruins of Cologne, under the shadow of the cathedral, German crews learned a truth that echoed long after the guns fell silent. Technological superiority is fleeting, but industrial will and the power of innovation endure. And in that moment, the hunters became the hunted.